So welcome everyone. We are reaching the 11th week of African history through the lens of economics, the open access teaching initiative that we launched at LBS Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, alongside my dear colleagues and friends, Nathan Nunn, Leonard Van Sekon, and Stelios Michalopoulos. While we feel saddened that this initiative comes to an end, we are very thrilled to introduce today's plenary session titled Africa's Latent Assets and Looking into the Future. And we couldn't have had and have dreamt of a better set of speakers to enlighten us about how Africa will look in the years to come. Let me start with our moderator, Chimenelu Okafor, who is a doctoral student at Harvard University at the Department of Government, where she's also a Graduate Prize Fellow and Carl Deutsch Fellow. Chimenelu, who was born in Umuozi at Anambra State in Nigeria, has done actually quite interesting work on gender issues and the representation of minorities. She's the founder and president of the Research in Color Foundation, a nonprofit organization which seeks to increase the number of historically excluded scholars in economics and economics-related social sciences more generally. Chimenelu, thanks a lot for joining us. Chimenelu will collect the questions posed to our two main speakers. Please start sending them as soon as you want. She will collect them and we'll pose them in the end. As always, we will leave at least half an hour for a Q&A. Let me now introduce our two main speakers, and let me start with Chima and Korieh, who is professor of African Studies at Marquette University in Nigeria. Actually, he's joining us from Nsukka, Nigeria, and there is an electricity shortage at the time. So Chima, thanks for managing to sort things out and joining us from your cell, if I understand correctly. Chima is doing very exciting work on historical issues, on gender in particular, on late 19th and early 20th century Western African history. He has also done some work on the Igbo, and he also has some ongoing work on war and empire, African society during World War II. Our other speaker, who will also initiate our discussion today, is Jim Robinson. James doesn't need much of an introduction to people doing research in political science, African history, economics, political economy. He has been a giant of the field in a series of path-breaking research pieces, many of them alongside with Simon Johnson and Daron Acemoglu. They have put forward very intriguing hypotheses stressing the role of institutions, culture and institutions shaping global development. He has published three books, if I count correctly, one with Daron on the economic origins of autocracy and dictatorship, which sadly becomes way more interesting for the latter part as for the former. Most people know him from his best-selling book with Daron Acemoglu, Why Nations Fail. More recently, he wrote another very influential book titled The Narrow Corridor, stressing the interplay between culture and institutions shaping long-run economic, social, and political development. Besides, Jim specializes also in the economic history and political economy of Latin America and Africa. So, Chima, Jim, and Chimenelu, thanks big time for being with us. We're really excited to see you all. Chimenelu, I think you're joining us from East Coast US, Jim from Chicago, and Chima, as I mentioned before, from Nsukka, Nigeria. I'm in London. So thanks a lot for joining. James, the floor is to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting us, and let's see what happens. So we're going to try to choreograph this in a very ambitious way. I'm going to talk. Hold on, I have some slides here. Here we are. We have some slides somewhere. I'm going to talk first, and then Chima is going to talk the power supply in Nsukka, if it'll cooperate with us. And then I'll come back again at the end. So I think, so this what we're going to talk about is we gave the title Africa's Latent Assets to sort of suggest that they were latent and not yet readily manifest in terms of economic dynamism or prosperity or whatever. But maybe we want to talk about Africa's assets as well, because actually some of them are, kind of engaging and are evident, and we'll give some examples of that. And I think what you've been hearing about in the last few weeks, we've heard a lot about many of the challenges in Africa in terms of African history of the slave trade and colonialism and predatory mining companies, and so the Cold War. There have been many challenges facing Africa, but I think like our starting point in this research agenda is just to say, whatever Marx might have said, history doesn't repeat itself. Okay, history is, the future is always different from the past. So I think we can get very blinded by obsessing with the past. My own previous research agenda notwithstanding. And remember, as Pliny the Elder put it, there's always something new out of Africa. So what we want to do is just really kind of lateral thinking on where is something new out of Africa going to come from, and where in society will it come from, or what will it look like? Okay, so we just want to talk about success and potential, and let me start with a thought experiment, just to sort of, as a kind of reality check on this exercise, and you're thinking like, oh, what a ludicrous agenda, we're all busy trying to explain the Africa dummy, in our growth regressions. Well, imagine, we were standing here or sitting here in 1978 and thinking about China's prospects for development. There were probably, conferences at the NBER where they sat around and wrung their hands and said, oh, China, it's a basket case, Look at the long run. Look at the 200 years before 1978. By the second half of the 18th century, the Qing fiscal system had collapsed. The granaries system didn't work. The Grand Canal silted up. There was massive corruption. In the 19th century, there was rebellion, millions of people starved to death, there was state failure, warlords, the communist revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, millions of people died, were murdered. It was absolute chaos for 200 years, So after that history, who could ever have predicted, that Deng Xiaoping would do a few things and suddenly the growth rate would go to 10% a year for 40 years? I think absolutely nobody predicted that. Okay, so that's a kind of humbling thing for social scientists like ourselves, isn't it? To think about that. Like, we would never have been able to predict that. And why would we? So here's one way of thinking about that. Why was it that how could that happen? Well, it could be just you just got monetary policy right, and then everything moves. But actually, I think it's a much more we think it's a much more sociological thing, that actually, despite all that chaos and despite all of those problems and challenges for 200 years, underneath it, there were aspects of Chinese society that were extremely compatible with rapid capitalist development. So here's one example of that, which you'll see is kind of relevant for discussing Africa, which is, Confucius says in the Analects, promote those who are worthy and talented. There's this notion of sort of meritocracy in China, which is a heck of an asset, when it comes to fostering entrepreneurship and innovation and capitalist development. Okay, so when we started thinking about this, the idea was to sort of identify, oh, great, there's a sort of latent asset. Could there be similar latent assets in African society? It's just they haven't manifested themselves in economic dynamism in the same way, that meritocracy, that's the way people do things in China, but that couldn't engage while the Cultural Revolution was going on, all the Great Leap Forward was going on, all warlords were rampaging around the country. Okay. So, this analogy is obvious, because a lot of the first part of the course has been about this, so just as China had a bad 200 years, maybe Africa had a bad, 400 or 500 years, it's about 500 years to the day, when the Portuguese managed to turn, the old kingdom of the Congo into a sort of slaving emporium. And, and you can tell all the story ever since then of all these negative shocks and whatever. But in the same way, you could have China, civil war, state collapse, communist revolution, one could say, okay? But we want to sort of take that train of thought and say, okay, fine, that's all true. And, and Nathan has run regressions showing it's true, and Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero and Elias and lots of other people, But we want to say, okay, maybe underneath all of that, all those challenges, there are latent assets. And so what could they be? So we've been brainstorming for a while about this. And we're going to talk about three, but probably lots of other things will come up, because I don't think this is the extent of the issue at all. And the first one is, and we're going to present some data, so it's not just aspirational or wishful thinking. So the first one is, and this is something that's always kind of struck me working in Africa, is that unlike, many of the very hierarchical societies in Asia and Latin America, African societies are much more achievement-based, like China. Maybe meritocracy doesn't work like the same way. I don't think there was a Chinese Confucius, but it's very African society is very achievement-based. And just like meritocracy in China, that's a heck of a thing for entrepreneurship. Okay, so that's what I'm going to start by talking about some data, and then I'll pass that over to Chima, and he'll talk about the second latent asset, which is cosmopolitanism of Africa. So I, like the diversity of Africa in social science is usually treated as a sort of disastrous, problem. Oh, it's so diverse. We can construct these indices of ethno-linguistic fragmentation and show how it causes all these bad things. But, I've always thought myself the opposite were true. All this diversity is actually one of the things that makes Africa so exciting as an outsider to come and just experience that incredible diversity. Africans are so used to dealing with diversity in a way that, English people, for example, are not, and they can't, English people can't handle it, So the second thing is going to be, and it's, there's lots of aspects, I think, of this cosmopolitanism and inclusiveness of African society. But in a globalized world, who's in an increasingly globalized world, who's going to thrive? Who's best able to thrive? And for me, it's Africans, not English people. English people can't even stand the French or the European Union. We're willing to commit economic, suicide in order to avoid interacting with French people. So that's not an attitude that's going to get you anywhere in the modern world. Okay. Finally, so that Chima's going to talk about that different aspects of that. And then finally, I'm going to come back and I'll talk about, something else again that we've talked about, which is this skepticism towards power. There's a great book about the history of Latin America by a Mexican historian called Enrique Krause, which is called Redeemers. So he tells the history of Latin America through the history of redeemers, starting with Simon Bolivar. Like, people in Latin America want to be saved. They want to be saved by Chavez or Perón or AMLO in Mexico at the moment, or, Bolivar, or whoever it is, or, Fidel Castro or Che Guevara. You put your trust in charismatic individuals who you think are going to save them. Okay. So I don't think that's how people think in Africa, and we'll show you some data. You might get stuck with President Museveni decade after decade, but nobody thinks he's going to save you, and it could be expedient if you're in the right place at the right time. But people are very skeptical about authority in Africa. And the point here is to sort of, this is about the political culture, I would say. I think there's deep historical roots of that, and that's deeply connected to African state formation historically. And I'll show you some evidence on that when I come back and talk about that a little bit more, because, Eastern Nigeria is a very interesting place to study exactly this. And our point here is just that, if you think about that skepticism of authority, the idea that authority is going to be abused and you need to anticipate that and kind of organize institutions appropriately, that's exactly the attitude that created the world's most functioning political systems, in Britain, in the United States. It was because Madison and Hamilton were skeptical about authority that they managed to create an institutional design that got Donald Trump out of office, that they knew that was coming and they anticipated it. So you have an endless mess in Latin America because, what happens when you have a charismatic populace? People dismantle checks and balances, and they dismantle, separation of powers, and they concentrate power in the leader who's going to save them. And so I think, where does that leave Africans? It leaves them, with a political culture which is extremely kind of synergetic with building effective political institutions. That's a heck of a challenge, given the post-colonial world that colonial powers bequeathed to Africans. You know, they created a thing called Nigeria with 250 different people, with 250 peoples, with 250 different social contracts and cultures, and you know, and then they just said, well, you know, get on with it, you know, and so that's a work in progress. But when it sorts itself out, and it will, it'll create a state, you know, which is far more functional than many other types of states we've seen in the world. Okay, so without further ado, let me jump into talking about the achievement basis of society. Okay, so what's the evidence for that? Well, there's a lot of work by sociologists actually in working in Africa on this. So there's a large kind of literature on this, but let me just show you a few kind of facts which I find we find pretty startling. Okay, so one is just data on social mobility. So in the Afrobarometer, they ask questions about social mobility, and they ask you, you know, to put your income on the scale of 0 to 10, or 1 to 10 in Latin America, 0 to 10 in Africa, and they ask you to put your parents on the same scale. So we can look at the kind of correlation between your income and your parental income. All right. So in a place with very little social mobility, where would you think of in the world? Well, Latin America. You know, Latin America is the continent of inequality and hierarchy and lack of social mobility. So in a place with little social mobility, it ought to be the case that your parental income was a very good predictor of your own income. Okay, and that's what you see in Latin America. All right, so on the horizontal axis you have your parents' income. Right, this is 1 to 10. Afrobarometer does 0 to 10, but the Latino Barometro does 1 to 10. So parents are on the horizontal axis. Your own position is on the vertical axis, and you can see a lot of the data is on the 45-degree line. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the mass of data at that point, you know. So you can see the most common thing is 5, 5. So your parents' income was 5, and you report your income as 5. So your parents' income perfectly predicts your income. Okay, there's a lot of data on the 45-degree line. Okay, so that's what you'd expect in Latin America, and that's what you'd see. What would you expect in Africa? In Africa, the data's all over the place. You can see that it's much less clustered on the 45-degree line. Okay, your parental position is much less good as a predictor. In fact, in Latin America, 52% of respondents report the same income as their parents. Okay, in Africa, that's only 20%. All right, so your parental income is much less of a predictor of your own income. Okay, and in fact, putting together these different comparative data sources, Africa has the most social mobility in this sense, measured in this sense, of anywhere in the world, including the US. Okay, in the US, 40% of respondents in comparable surveys report the same income as their parents. Okay, so there's a lot of movement around, and it's true if I compare, if you break the data down into urban and rural, it's true in urban and rural. If you break it down by gender, men, women, same. Lots of social mobility. Okay, so we're interpreting this as, you know, society has this achievement. This is evidence of an achievement basis. Okay, you might ask about what about actual mobility? So this is just, you know, perceptions or self-reported income. So you might say, well, what about observed income? Well, that's hard to say anything about that. Elias and Stelios have been doing a lot of work on educational mobility, and you know, and the facts there are, you know, first of all, I'd say, you know, reported mobility is important. There's a lot of research on that showing, you know, people's expectations of mobility or kind of perceptions of mobility may be actually more important in terms of decision making or political preferences than observed mobility. But if you look at educational mobility, for example, from the World Bank data set, then, you know, I don't think I have the picture here. I don't have the picture, but what you see is many parts of Africa, Kenya, Ghana, have the same rates of educational mobility as Western Europe. So the picture is different in the sense that if I look at educational mobility, if we look at education mobility, Africa looks, you know, it looks less mobile than North America or Western Europe. But parts of Africa is very heterogeneous, and parts of Africa are as mobile as anywhere in the world. Okay, so next piece of evidence on achieved status. The World Value Survey asks you to choose, you know, between Okay, how do you get a better life? What brings a better life? Hard work on the one hand, hard work, and on the other hand, luck and connections. Okay, so a stylized view of African society, would be Africa's very networked, and it's all about connections and very personalized, and so obviously Africans are going to say it's all about connections here. Okay, but the startling fact is when you look at the data and the World Value Survey, kind of putting together all the answers across the world. On the left here is, think of this axis as a sort of continuum. On the left is, the most extreme hard work. You have to work hard to get ahead. That brings success. On the right, it's luck and connections. Africa is red. So Africans are more likely than anyone else in the world to say the way to get on is hard work. Okay. The Latin Americans are by far the most likely to say it's all luck and connections. And in fact, the blue line is North America, United States, and Canada, and you can see that's more or less similar to Africa. Okay, so that's remarkable, and how is that consistent with this notion that African society is very kind of networked and personal? I think it is consistent because networks are endogenous to your effort. You can make connections to people. You can create links in a network, and fictive kin, and you can make connections. And so African society can be both very networked, but it can also be, it can be responsive to hard work. I guess that's how we would interpret this. Okay, and then one more, just one more fact, and then I'll shut up on kind of achieved status, is just to say, something else in the World Value Survey is, this is a question that economists have kind of done a lot of things with, about, what would you like, what sort of values would you like your children to have? So what things do you aspire to your children to have? So one of the things is hard work. Okay, so hard work, and you could think about this in terms of, why do you think hard work pays off so much? Well, there's all this social mobility, right? So the picture fits together. And if you see, if you look across the world again, and you ask, what proportion of people in different countries name, you can mark 5 of these things, religious faith, thrift, unselfishness, etc. But one of them is hard work. So what proportion of people mark hard work as a value that they want their children to have? Africa is, up there at the top. Okay, so Latin America is at the bottom. This is a kind of anti-Latin America paper, but you can't argue with facts, can you? So again, remarkable. Africans think hard work pays off, and that's what we want to have for our children. Okay, so let me. I'm going to manipulate the slides, but I'll let Chima talk a bit about cosmopolitanism now. You're muted. Okay.
Yes, I'm here now. Okay. Thanks very much, James. I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about the way they are shaped and wired different from Europeans, and I think also this sort of affects and influences economic thinking about as James has mentioned, Africans are very cosmopolitan. I think that is sort of evident in the sort of diversity that you find in Africa. You made mention of multilingualism here in Africa, that perhaps in Africa you have over 800 different linguistic groups. Now, does this offer an advantage or disadvantage to Africans and African societies? I think it has a lot of advantages. It in many ways presents opportunity for a much more better intergroup relations. But if one looks at East Africa, for example, many people in East Africa speak 3 or 4 languages. They speak Swahili, they speak Kikuyu, they speak, Luo, they speak other languages, and they speak English, they speak a lot of other languages. And that really creates sort of a new dynamic, a very important dynamic when you look at societies in where people speak a variety of languages. One of the advantages here, of course, is, it creates a much more inclusive society. But one also has to understand or look at the worldview of Africans and how this can also translate into economic opportunities or economic dynamics, or shapes the political economy of African societies. One is the notion, an idea of wealth in people. I think many Africans see the idea of wealth in people as paramount than your individual wealth. So the notion of wealth in people enables African societies, in some cases, to incorporate others, incorporate strangers, incorporate people who, can bring some wealth and bring opportunity to any group. That, I think, is very important for many African societies, this notion of wealth in people. But it also translates into this ethical philosophy that is in South Africa or Southern Africa is called Ubuntu. The idea that a person exists because it is part of a larger group. And it doesn't just exist in South Africa, it goes across many African societies. Perhaps among the Igbo, you have the same sort of phenomenon. But how does this translate into economic opportunity? But what we think is, in many ways, it creates opportunity for economic opportunity for nearly every member of society. In other words, the idea of an egalitarian society, which is fundamental when you look at African indigenous economies. The idea of an egalitarian society is provided in this sort of ethical philosophy. So among the Igbo, for example, every member of a community has access to the most important basic factor of production, which is land. So long as you are a member of a community and you are a member of a king group that is recognized, you have access to land. And that's great opportunity for everyone within that society to create their own wealth. But it's also tied to some basic idea, particularly among the Igbo, that once life and opportunities in life is guided and regulated by one's chi, or your personal guiding. So that each person is created with a personal chi, and your chi is what shapes your life. And as James mentioned earlier, this is fundamental in terms of the sort of achievement-based society that is evident in many African societies, but also really shapes the outlook and shapes Igbo outlook to life. That opportunity for economic opportunity, for equal opportunity, for opportunity to achieve more than your father. So the Igbo, for example, would say, Nwam Karakwam, which means, may my child be greater than me. This is very fundamental in terms of understanding Igbo attitude towards life and the sort of nature of their society. So here, whether we are looking at East Africa, West Africa, or Central Africa, that sort of attitude towards life, wealth, and people, and the way they collapse together to shape the people's worldview is very fundamental. And I think to a very large extent, that is an important asset which exists in Africa and which provides, I think, important opportunity for African societies. Another one, of course, is to look at how African societies understand gender and gender ideology. Here, gender is seen in terms of cooperation between the different sexes rather than competition. And it's evident in the way many African societies see the role of men and women. And that sort of dual sex political role is also important in understanding the economic life of many African societies. The Igbo, for example, would have yam as the most important crop, but yam is seen as the male crop. Women also would have their own crop, cassava, cocoyam, and these are seen in terms of their ritual purposes as equal to each other. So the gendered nature of African societies is much more fluid than the European idea about gender or the role of men and the role of women in society. That is an important asset that African societies have. And that the notion, I think in many ways, the notion of women's liberation that came with colonial encounter was something that was already deeply embedded in the indigenous culture of many African societies. So here, these, I think, are very important assets that African societies have. So it will be important to think about this in the understanding the nature and notion of an achievement-oriented society, such as the Igbo and many other African societies. One, of course, as James mentioned earlier, is the understanding of the notion of equality or egalitarian nature of the Igbo society and many other, particularly the so-called acephalous or decentralized societies. The dynamic nature of their society influences the political economy in many ways. The Igbo would say, for example, Igbo enweze, which means the Igbos have no king. It doesn't mean that there's an absence of power and authority or absence of law and order. It only means that every individual within the society has the potentials to achieve whatever they can achieve in society. And they can do that without the hindrance of any sort of political system or structure that limits the power of individuals to achieve their potentials. And I think this is sort of very important for not just the Igbo, but for many African societies. Something that is sort of different also from the nature and structure of the institutions that became planted in African societies as a result of colonialism. The idea of a structural society, the idea of leadership and control of power that came with colonialism was quite different from what was existing in many traditional societies before the European encounter. And those were ones that gave people opportunity to become the best they can be, whether they were men, women, and or strangers. So long as people have been incorporated within that society, they have access to the resources that will enable them to become viable and contributing members of that society, whether politically, economically, and socially. It doesn't mean that there doesn't exist the absence or exclusion of certain individuals from playing certain roles. So, but that in many ways does not limit the economic powers and opportunities that exist for the majority of people within African societies. See anything you want me to go ahead, James?
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Why don't I talk a little bit about I think that's fantastic. The politics and then we can get questions. Is that good?
Sure. Yeah.
I wanted to, one of the things. Where am I? Okay. One of the things I was going to put this up. One of the things I was going to talk about. No, where is it? Here. That one thing that Chima was talking about, which I find sort of very impressive about Igbo society compared to, say, the United States, is that in Igbo society there's this notion that everybody is important, everybody is significant, and everybody has an important role to play. Chima's colleague Francis Njoku, who's a philosopher at the University of Nigeria, he likes to quote proverbs, So, and he always says, the tall man is needed when hanging the roof of a building, but the short man is needed when you're looking for something on the ground. Everybody's needed and everybody's important. And, it's almost as like the philosopher Michael Sandel's notion of contributive justice. There's a sense that everyone's contributing to the community, and whereas in the United States nowadays there's winners and there's losers. And if you're a loser, and suck it up. So that that's not an ethical principle that I find very attractive, and I think we see some of the fallout from that politically in this country at the moment. And so I think we have a lot to learn. I mean, I personally think we have a lot to learn from the ontologies and the worldviews of Africans, which are radically more egalitarian, than our own in some sense. So let me talk a little bit about. There was a lot of things we could have talked about here, but we didn't. But that was fantastic. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about this notion that the third latent asset. I think Chima is throwing a lot of ideas out there, in terms of these gender relations also, which is sort of fascinating, which you could say that's not just a latent asset. It is an asset, and the autonomy of women relative to men and having their own sphere economically, politically, socially. But to go back to politics and talk about the skepticism of authority, how would I think about that? You might think that Africa, post-colonial Africa, has been covered in dictatorships, and you still have these incredibly long-running autocratic regimes, in Gabon or Cameroon or Chad or Uganda. Many places haven't made a transition to kind of more democratic regimes. Congo Brazzaville, there's many of these places left still. But I guess our point is, that doesn't reflect what Africans want. They may get stuck, with it, but that doesn't reflect. They just don't have mechanisms for inducing accountability or creating more socially legitimate regimes. So what we did was we put together data from the Afrobarometer on people's attitudes towards, for example, having a strong, unchecked leader. Okay, so what you find, of course, people in Australia and New Zealand don't like having strong, unchecked leaders. But if you look at Africa compared to the rest of the world, again, Africans are more likely to reject strong, unchecked leaders than more or less anywhere else in the world. I think what we think is most interesting is that if you get into the sort of the more micro level, there's you can formulate hypotheses about the connection between what I was calling, or what we were calling, African political culture and political institutions and these attitudes today. So, for example, Chima was quite quoting, the Igbo have no king. So this is a sort of proverb: the Igbo have no king. That the Igbo was it was organized, but politically very decentralized. It wasn't, the society was organized in sort of independent villages and not into large states or kingdom. But of course, that's not true everywhere in Nigeria. In the north of Nigeria, in Hausa land or amongst the Fulani, you had much more centralized states. And then you had kind of intermediate places like Yoruba and Nupe, where there were states also. So one thing we did with Afrobarometer data was just kind of break down these attitudes towards authority, both to show, in sort of comparatively that Africans are skeptical of power in the same way Europeans or North Americans are, but also that heterogeneity in those attitudes maps onto kind of historical patterns of political institutions. So, for example, if you just think about that comparison I made between, places like the Igbo, or just to the north, the Tiv, or you could say the Ibibio, close to Igbo, also, historically not organized. Ibibio society wasn't historically organized in states. And you compare that to the attitudes of Hausa and Fulani people from the Afrobarometer, what you see is that the Igbo and the Tiv are much more likely to strongly disapprove of one-man rule than the Fulani and Hausa are. Okay, so that reflects the kind of historical attitude towards authority and concentrated power that kept Igbo and Tiv society kind of decentralized politically. These survey attitudes, this is today, reflect the history of political development, I think. So this is just to kind of fold back this argument into some of the kind of mechanisms about political development. So this works exactly as you'd anticipate it to work, that parts of Africa which were less centralized politically historically are more skeptical about authority. Okay, so it works within Africa and it works between Africa and the rest of the world. So the argument is just, of course, there's challenges building modern effective centralized state institutions, but that that takes time and it's a work in progress. But when it happens, it'll create much more functional states than in China, for example. That's the argument. Okay, so last slide, and then I think we're finishing kind of more or less on time. I think this is more like an agenda or a kind of lateral thinking. I think Chima and I will be happy, and we'll have succeeded if we get you going away from this session thinking, where are Africa's assets, and let's try to think in a different way. I always think that, what happens in social science research is we're so kind of focused on trying to understand why Africa is poor and why there's all these civil wars and why there's all these dictatorships, and so we're always focused on all the negative things, that it must be an absence of something or a lack of something, or something must be going wrong, or so you're so focused on looking for negative things, you don't even notice all the positive things that are kind of sitting around, So I think this is just it's a call for creativity and lateral thinking more than anything else. So we're just suggesting some examples that that strike us as being interesting, but there's probably lots of other ones that you could think of, and if you start thinking about them, we'll be really happy. Okay, this is not to say that Nigeria is going to start, or anywhere else in Africa. I mean, some parts of Africa are already flourishing, but it's not to say that there aren't huge challenges in Nigeria or Democratic Republic of Congo or any other place. And there are lots of problems of bad governance and lack of accountability and corruption, and that needs to be solved. But if you think about the Chinese case again, that's rather interesting. That in the sense that Deng Xiaoping didn't solve every problem in 1978, they still haven't solved lots of problems. There still isn't a real independent judiciary in China, for example. So there's a work in progress, but you don't have to get everything right for things to start moving. That's the Chinese case, and there's all sorts of potential for improvisation or hybrid solutions. Think about the township village enterprises. That was a great example of a kind of hybrid solution improvised to secure entrepreneurs' property rights so they could invest. And I think, we were going to talk about this, but then we realized we didn't have time really, that, in African history is full of hybrid solutions, particular the fact that society was politically, kind of decentralized meant that, there were public goods that people recognized it would be good to provide, but there weren't state institutions to provide them. So how else do you provide them? Well, you create substitutes. You create substitutes for those. Okay, and there's many examples of that in African history. So the Africans are good at creating hybrids, just the way the Chinese did with the township village enterprise. And I think there's a need to kind of think much more. I'm repeating myself now, so I should shut up. And just, our last bullet point here, which is people think, you use the word assets and people start Africa's assets and they start thinking about like coltan and copper and things like that. But, that's every economist knows that, the real asset of a country is not its natural resource wealth. Natural resource wealth is neither necessary nor sufficient, to flourish economically. We know that. And the real asset as the people and their history and their culture and their creativity and their energy. And that's all there in Africa. That's the point. Yeah. Okay. Let me shut up. And do you have anything else to say, Chima?
No, I think that's, I don't know what's happening with, okay, I don't know. I'm moving this stuff around to get some better lightning. Yeah. But I think that's, that's great. And I think just one last word before the questions is perhaps one needs to understand African societies and African economies today by looking back to what was going on, what were the dynamics within Africa before European contact. And I think it's important to sort of measure economic dynamics and economic opportunities and by looking at how people interacted and utilized the resources within their environment and the opportunities to provide people rather than, these global measurements of, what we think is wealth and how it's generated.
Okay, Elias.
Awesome. James and Chima, thank you so much for the presentation. It was incredibly insightful, but also exciting and forward-looking. So there's much progress that we can make with the foundations that you both have laid out with regard to Africa's latent assets. So we're going to shift gears right now, and we'll ask you both a few questions from the audience to clarify what you've spoken about. And I'll ask the questions to both of you all, so feel free to jump in whenever you need to. And so the first question we have is, how do you reconcile the fact that in practice, the idea of meritocracy, or the idea that hard work leads to success, seems to be at war with obstacles such as corruption and nepotism in the African context? And that's for either of you to answer.
Okay.
Shall I go? Who wants to go? We could both go.
Go ahead, James.
I would say, let me say something and then Chima can say something just to get the ball rolling. I think that, there's massive corruption in China. There's enormous amount of corruption in China. I think what you learn from the Chinese case is that, these things can coexist, that meritocracy and corruption can coexist, that, humans are humans, the same, the whole world over. And there can be different norms and social practices, and that they can coexist. And yeah, there is corruption in Africa, but I don't think corruption, and I think corruption is bad for incentives, and it's bad for the provision of public resources, and in all the ways that we kind of understand in economics. But I think the evidence suggests that that on its own, that the return to investment can still be sufficiently high even when there's a lot of corruption. And I think nepotism, again, there's nepotism everywhere in the world, but I think often what people think of nepotism in Africa is more to do with the kind of social embeddedness of practices and institutions, and just a different kind of social logic than there is in the West. And I think that's fine, because I think that what may look corrupt to people in the West, doesn't look corrupt to Africans. I always like the example of Denmark. For Francis Fukuyama, always sort of says, well, the ideal in development is for everyone to look like Denmark, but actually, I have these colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, and at the University of Copenhagen, the entire faculty are people who did their PhDs, almost without exception, did their PhDs at the University of Copenhagen. So a practice that in the United States would be thought to be incredibly nepotistic and corrupt is how they hire their faculty in Copenhagen, So I think that's just to show that's perfectly fine in Denmark, and the Danes don't call it nepotism. In America, people would be outraged if that happened, and they'd say it was completely corrupt and nepotistic. But it's culturally relative, So I think that's a nice example for showing that even Denmark, supposedly the world's most successful society, has what Americans would call highly nepotistic practices. So I think that's how I think about it.
And Chima, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to understand these, these activities within Africa, within the context of states that are still in the making. I think if one looks at perhaps pre-colonial African societies, how did people relate and control, right, public property for public good? That's quite different from the sort of new states that have emerged in Africa, where other structures such as, ethnicity and the way even this, in some cases, the colonial state enabled certain groups of individuals or certain groups of people to control others. Some of them have continued within the post-colonial state. So if you look at Nigeria, take Nigeria as an example, the North is sort of invested with the idea that political power belongs to the North because the British enabled them to think like that. And the British enabled political power to be concentrated within a particular group in Nigeria. So for them, this is part of a new system of structures that came with the modern political states and structures in the country. So the contestations over scarce resources or over national wealth and ensuring that these often are concentrated within, certain ethnic groups, I think in many ways enables, has enabled, corruption and practices that, many people have found repulsive. So, but there are also certain things that would happen, like in the United States, past President Trump appointed his daughter and his son-in-law and people within his circle into the government. Many people will raise a lot of issues and concerns with that, right? Even in some of the countries like Nigeria, where you think political power is being concentrated within certain ethnic groups. So I think this happens in nearly every society, but I think we got to look at it in terms of how relatively, so to say, for each society.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense, and I hope that answered one of the participants' questions. And so, moving forward, I want to ask: could you clarify how multilingualism positively impacts African society? Do you think it creates any opportunities in terms of economic growth or, network strengthening of network ties, perhaps? Could you just sort of give us a little bit more insight on that?
So maybe I can talk about the research of my colleague at University of Chicago, Catherine Kinsler. So Catherine is a social psychologist who's done a lot of work on multilingualism and the advantages of multilingualism. So I think the argument here is not that it's particularly advantageous in the world to speak Igbo, or Lingala or something, but multilingualism is a kind of marker of a much more kind of nimble cultural attitude or mindset. So what Catherine has done is she shows that, for example, you're much more rational in a second language than you are in your first language. So, you're born, you grow up speaking some language, you learn other languages. People are more rational in second languages. People are more able to see other people's point of view. in second languages. So she's done a lot of social psychology experiments showing how multilingual kind of affects the way you think about the world and the way you think about, other people's perspectives and other people's ideas, and the way you kind of challenge yourself. So I think there's a lot of social. So I would say that's the kind of scientific basis for this claim. So I think, we think that's something, that facilitates creativity. It facilitates kind of absorbing, as Chima was saying, many African societies, they have the same word for guest and stranger. And, why? Because Africans were moving around, they were being absorbed into different societies and different cultures. And I think that's a sort of, I think multilingualism is a sort of, we want to say that's a marker of a kind of particular type of cultural flexibility, which seems to be very important for adapting in the modern world. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Okay. Chima, do you have any other additional thoughts on that? But that was wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's great. But, for example, it's important to perhaps think about how people within most of sub-Saharan Africa come to speak languages that are related, to each other, right? And so that people are able to communicate and understand, other languages enables, for closer interaction, integration. It creates sort of an intergroup relation that is much more dynamic. So I go to Ghana, if I can speak, Ewe, people within the Ewe society would regard me as one of their own. I know a lot of Hausa people who come to my village to buy stuff. When they speak Igbo, they make a better deal, right? From the woman who wants to sell to them, because they speak Igbo. And it's the same if you speak Hausa, you go to the north in the market, you get a better deal. So that, I think, in itself, is very important, not only in terms of bringing people together, but also enabling, economic, economic systems to function much more effectively than otherwise would be the case.
Excellent. Thank you. And so moving forward, I wanted to ask, in building the latent potentials of Africa, how can the institutions that support the development of these potentials be promoted, supported, and financed, especially when we're dealing with the context of Africa, which usually has, weak institutions? Could you kind of expand on that?
Who's going to tackle that?
Okay. Well, I think it's perhaps also important to think about what has happened in some post-conflict societies in Africa that have invested in social programs and programs that tend to bring people together, and invested in institutions that tend to emphasize the importance of accommodation, the importance of accepting one another, and the importance of developing a sense of identity that goes beyond one's own ethnic group. I think that is sort of very important. So some societies have experimented on that. Nigeria in the past, had what they called MAMSA, which sort of this social program, mass mobilization, and appointing people from all over, or the National Youth Service, for example, where people from various ethnic groups are posted to other states or other ethnic groups, because they're looking at that as one way in which they can create, national integration and understanding, broader understanding that will be central and important in terms of nation building. So I think there are certain programs that can create opportunity for integration, opportunity for developing new identities, and opportunity for the emergence of or building from have been created all over Africa. Those are things ways to which the government or governments have attempted to with the problem.
Yeah, so I have some ideas. So I think when you think about institution building or what path to institution building, I think that's where the specificities of African societies come into play, and there's so much heterogeneity, and any answer is going to involve the local context. Think about, I worked for many years in Sierra Leone, and one thing that's sort of fascinating about Sierra Leone is after the civil war ended, tens of thousands of young men with machetes and AK-47s, kind of carnage, horrific violence, displacement. Most societies never move on from something like that. I worked for 30 years in Colombia. The Colombians, they had a peace agreement, but everything is as chaotic and violent as ever. The Colombia never moves on from that. But Sierra Leone did. Sierra Leone, you can go anywhere in the bush. You never see a gun. The homicide rate is lower than the United States and Sierra. It's extremely peaceful. So how did they manage that transition? That's got everything to do with the strength and legitimacy of the traditional institutions, that the people, the young men, were reabsorbed back into society, and they have all sorts of traditional mechanisms for reincorporating people, traditional mechanisms of transitional justice, of kind of healing and repairing. And so Sierra Leone is not a development miracle yet, but it's a heck of a peace, kind of miracle or post-Civil War transition, but based on the strengths of its traditional institutions. I think that, that's what's fascinating. Or think of Somaliland. What has Somaliland done in the last 30 years? The state collapsed, and Somaliland got the chance to rebuild itself, rebuild its institutions from ground up, and instead of with these silly institutions the British created or left in Mogadishu, they built their own institutions specific to their own society and their own social structures and their own political culture, but so few places in Africa have kind of had the space to do that, So I think that's where we have to look. We have to look at genuine African solutions to these problems based on what's legitimate in society and what works for people. And that's very different in Somaliland than it is in Sierra Leone. And it'll be different everywhere you look. And as outsiders, you talk about financing, or what we should be doing is creating space for Africans to do that, not telling them what to do or experimenting on them. We should be understanding, like my friend Paul Farmer, who passed away sadly recently, the founders of Partners in Health. Paul always avoided using the word, he never used the word development or developing. He used the word accompaniment, like Africans don't need developing. They need everyone needs help. I need help, So outsiders can always play a role, but it's about accompaniment. I always like that. I don't use that word enough, but I like it. Yes, sorry.
Wonderful. So do you think, I guess adjacent to that question in your responses, do you think that these sorts of local governments can have a role in promoting greater international or intra-African social cohesion or economic progress in that sense? Do you think that that's a way in which we can see that manifestation happen positively?
I think what's happened in Somaliland is they've managed to build this thing up from the ground up, and that's difficult because there's different institutions and there's vested interests, and but I think what you see in Sierra Leone now is there's a genuine sort of attempt to kind of bridge these local structures, and you see institutions emerging, NGOs run by Sierra Leoneans kind of trying to mold practices of accountability and change the sort of political dynamics. So I think given realities of the modern world, you're kind of stuck with these nation states. I mean, not many places have the freedom that Somaliland did, so you have to find a reconciliation between these different sorts of institutions, and that has to be negotiated. It has to be, but that can happen. I mean, it happened in Botswana. In some sense, I always think the secret of Botswana was they were able, Seretse Khama and they were able to build these structures, kind of reconciling the traditional institutions with the modern nation state in Gaborone, in a way that was extremely functional. And that was the Swana people that did that. That wasn't outsiders. It wasn't the South Africans. It wasn't the World Bank. It was Seretse Khama and the Botswana Democratic Party that did that. So it's happened. It can happen again.
Any thoughts, Chima, or you just agree?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The idea of looking from within, right, in terms of building these institutions is very important. South Africa will be a very good example. Again, the Truth and Reconciliation, Commission in South Africa relied on sort of indigenous, systems of, transitional justice, and the idea of Ubuntu as a guiding philosophy. That society. That people within a society can't exist without each other. And I think that was very fundamental in terms of building a new society in South Africa. And those societies that have been able to do it, like Rwanda, for example, have been able to see sustained, economic and political and social stability, which I think is very important. So looking within Africa, looking at creating solutions from within Africa, I think is very important. The last few days, the last few weeks, I have been attending the local assembly in my village. And for me, sort of is a learning experience. It's called Aladema, right? Which is sort of at the very local level. This is the assembly of all adult male. And this is where most important decisions are made. Now, so sometimes you get a letter from the government that this is what we want for the community. For the community, they'll tell you, this is not what we want. This is the way we want it. And they are relying on, kinship systems, seniority, the gerontocracy in terms of making decisions of who should represent or which kindred should represent. And those are sort of very important in terms of understanding how stability can function. Can come within, political institutions at the local and even at a higher level. If people can rely on those sort of indigenous systems and, accommodate them in terms of creating new institutions.
Awesome, thank you. And I have one more question that I want to ask both of you. So does urban and rural inequality, such as the lack of good primary schools and secondary schools in rural areas, inhibit the full potential for latent assets in Africa to sort of be reached? And does that sort of also inhibit social mobility?
Now, I think many African societies, I'm talking from my own experience in Nigeria, the divide between the urban and rural areas in terms of education, I think is being bridged because now there's a lot of, private schools in the rural area, right? As much as you have in the urban area. That was the question, right? So I think that the educational opportunities are there at both the local and, at the rural and the urban areas. And they may not be as, well-funded, but parents have opportunity now to invest in their children in most of the primary schools that are, private. That is just sort of mushrooming in every corner of Nigeria. So that kind of balance is there. You don't have to go to the city or Lagos to find a good school for your kid in the rural area. So, and most of those who are competing at the national level, and some of them are coming from schools that are not located in the urban areas. Even though that's kind of divide is there, is the gap is closing every day.
Yeah, and just to kind of remind everyone of what I said earlier, in that data on social mobility, it's interesting. If you break it down, between rural and urban, it looks very similar. So it's not, the social mobility is not something just restricted to urban areas where there's more opportunities or whatever it is. It's everywhere, which is sort of striking, but that's what the data says. Yeah.
Awesome. And actually, we do have a bit more time, so I'm going to ask you more questions. So I had another question to ask. To what extent do you think increased inter-African trade could be part of the way forward in seeing Africa kind of, progress, not develop, but progress in some sense?
I'm not sure I have anything intelligent to say about that. I think that most. I think if you look at the long run and you think about kind of economic dynamism, it seems to be highly associated, for reasons that are somewhat controversial in economics, it seems to be highly associated with exporting. The British Industrial Revolution, what was the British Industrial Revolution? It was about exporting textiles, more or less. Textiles was the most dynamic sector, and the majority of textile production in Britain, in the early 19th century, was exported. So, and I think if you think about think about the East Asian miracle, think about Japan or China or Taiwan or South Korea, or not so famous miracles like Mauritius or whatever, then they're all based on exporting. I don't know, there's mechanisms, you could think that if you export stuff, you have to produce high quality things that people want to buy. And so, so it's something which creates a sort of push towards high quality, or it creates competition, or so there's mechanisms that link, trade to kind of productivity, I suppose. So I'm sure, that's got to be a good thing, and it's got to be a good thing that African countries trade with each other, and not just with each other, but everybody and the rest of the world, and I think that's, I don't know, that's not. I told you I didn't have anything very intelligent to say about it.
That's completely okay. It sounded great though. But I guess I have something that's a little bit more adjacent to what we were discussing previously. Is there any evidence that certain African traditions or characteristics, or perhaps even the latent assets that we're discussing, are prone to being exploited? Since that is a lot of what has happened in the past in the African context.
Can you come again?
So is there any evidence that the latent assets that Africa does have, like the characteristics, either the traditions or what you all have touched upon, are prone to being exploited?
Oh, I think we're looking at that in terms of the potentials and the opportunities that it provides African societies and economies, and the potentials for growth that, these assets within the continent can change the nature of African, economy and Africa's relationship with the global economy, so that these assets have opportunity to generate growth, right, within Africa. But if one could link that to trade and relationship within African societies, you have to look at how those assets could enable the change in the relationship within Africa, but also outside of the continent. I think you may be able to produce all the cocoa you can produce, but if you can't turn the cocoa into chocolate and export within or outside Africa, then the possibility of greater economic, growth, right, and integration into the global economy is still going to be limited. Because if there's 30% tariff on chocolate manufactured in Ghana coming to the US, then Africans are not going to have, I don't think many African societies then would have, the opportunity to be able to compete, in this global market. If the palm oil in Nigeria can be exported raw for manufacturing soap in Britain and other areas, and then the soap comes back to Nigeria at a higher cost, then the economic and I think comparative advantage in manufacturing raw materials has been enabled by the colonial system, but it has continued also in the post-colonial system in other guises. So those potentials, I think the global economy is been structured in a way, I think, that Africans do not have a lot of options at this moment. Perhaps, within the continent, but also people have to have sort of the enabling power to be able to purchase. For example, South Africa produces wine, but how competitive is South African wine in Nigeria? And that one produced in Italy or in Spain. So there's need also for change in terms of orientation, because one would, it may come cheaper from Spain, right? And than the one produced in South Africa.
Yes, I think I wanted to clarify it's exploited, not exported.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yes, like okay. Exploitation.
Okay.
It's okay.
Let me say
in any case.
Yeah, so let me say something. I think I think we could relate your question to this earlier discussion of multilingualism and kind of coping with other cultures. If you think about the economic success of Mauritius, for example, the Mauritians were able to leverage these contacts with Indians and Chinese business people for finance and expertise and human capital, and so I think that this cosmopolitanism that Chima talked about actually enormously helps, in attracting investment and relating to outsiders. Like, who's going to learn Chinese? English people? No, but Africans will learn Chinese, because they're so used to learning other languages. English people know, like when Nissan had their big factory in Sunderland and Nissan said, if we have Brexit, we're going to disinvest from England and move production to Europe. Everyone in Sunderland said, who cares? Let's get rid of the Japanese people and vote for Brexit, So it is related to this, embracing foreign investment and facilitating foreign ties and arbitraging and mediating so I think that's the answer you were looking for. I don't know. It makes more sense than my first answer, but
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we have 5 minutes left in our session, and so I do want to wrap it up right now. And so, Elias, if you can take it away. Thank you so much, James and Chima, for the great session and also the great answers to the questions that I've asked. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Chima, dear James, and Chimanello, thanks big time. I think all of our friends could see how Nathan, Stelios, and I got inspired by Jim with all this energy and his insights, blending Confucius with African proverbs. He's also very knowledgeable about ancient Greek history, which was a big plus for me. Chima, thanks a lot, big time also from your remarks. Thanks a lot for joining us despite the power outrage. Chimanello, as always, you have been fantastic collecting the various questions and posing them to Jim and Chima. Thank you all for joining us. Tomorrow, we will have our concluding session where actually Nathan will discuss with Joe Heinrich about culture. So effectively, our discussion tomorrow will continue on our current debate with Jim and Chima and Chimanello about cultural aspects of Africans and how they can serve as a backbone for growth in the decades to come. So I hope that you will all join us tomorrow. After the last session with Joe Heinrich, Nathan, Leonard, Stelios, and I will also take 10 minutes to say farewell and discuss how we can take this initiative forward. Thank you all for your many kind emails and remarks on behalf of the Wheeler team of Stelios, Nathan, and Leonard. Thank you all. Hope to see you tomorrow in our concluding session. Jim, Chimanello, and Chima, thanks big time for once more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you all.